and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about the fact that people's lives can be changed when you obey the voice of God. Let's go. Hey everybody, it's that Sunday School Girl of thatsundayschoolgirl.com. Welcome to the lesson for Sunday, October 7th. Can you believe it's the first Sunday of the fourth quarter of 2018? I posted a couple of days ago that games are won and lost in the fourth quarter, so it's time to hit the accelerator and let's finish out the year strong. I am super excited to be here to share this lesson with you, and I pray that you're having a wonderful week. If you're new around here, welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web. When I peaked last, we were approaching 13,000 members in this community who are just like you, who love God's Word, who are studying, preparing for Sunday school classes, but most of all, want to be inspired and encouraged to look at God's Word in a different way and to be able to live it out in our everyday lives. I'm going to ask everyone to make sure that you have hit the subscribe button so that you're connected to this community. And if you look, there is a bell that will pop up as well. That's your second step. You have to click it so that you get immediate notifications in your email when content is uploaded to this channel. Two things before we get into the lesson. Everyone knows how much I love the month of October, and October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. If you visited thatsundayschoolgirl.com this week, you will see that we have gone pink for the month on the website. If you haven't checked it out, do go over and visit the site. There's wonderful information. The lessons are there, teaching tips, growth strategies, a lot of good information, and there is the TSSG store. I mentioned last week that there would be a new item debuting for October, and she is now available. This is the Pink Hope shirt. It features the breast cancer awareness ribbon and an anchor, and the scripture is Hebrews 6:19, and it talks about hope being our anchor. And so if your churches have Pink Out Sundays coming up, or you just want to fight with a fighter or celebrate with a survivor, this is a beautiful shirt to do that with. The shirt is just $20. That does include your shipping. It will ship mid-month, and so if your churches are doing a Pink Out Sunday on the last Sunday of this month, it will be a great piece for you to wear. The last thing I want to remind you is that we are falling into Sunday school, and I hope that you have great incentives planned in your Sunday school as well that will encourage participation, attendance, and engagement. But for us, that means that every Sunday we're going to do something fun as well. So we had a test run last week. We were so close, but we did not quite make it. So let's try it again this week. Our incentive this week is 1,000 likes on this Facebook video gets us to a Starbucks gift card. And last week the gift card was $15. We're going to up it this week to $20. I want to give away a $20 gift card if we get to 1,000 likes on this YouTube video. So just click the like button. That lets us know that we're doing a good job. And if you want to be entered for the gift card, just leave a message down below in the YouTube video or on Facebook. Say something about the video, say hello, or just say enter me, but that's the only way that I have your name to enter you for the drawing for now a $20 gift card. I will check the stats on Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m. to see if we have a winner. That's it. Let's get into the lesson for this week. Our lesson title is Noah's Steadfast Faith. The Bible basis is Genesis chapter 6, verses 9 through 22. The Bible truth. Noah remained faithful to what God asked of him despite opposing circumstances. Our memory verse is verse 22, and the lesson aim is that we will remember Noah's faithfulness in obeying God's command to build the ark, repent of times when we have failed to follow God's instructions, and embrace the calling to do what God commands despite challenges. This week's lesson advances us in the book of Genesis to study about Noah. But don't think about this as if Adam and Eve just went away and suddenly we have Noah, because the pieces that we've learned up to this point are still very relevant. We saw creation, the creation of man, the fall of man last week in the garden, sin entering the earth, but most of all, the punishments that were given to the man, the woman, and the serpent. And specifically remember that God said that there would be enmity, there would be a war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that is very relevant as we look at the context of Noah's world. This week, we find a place that is corrupt, a place that no longer meets God's standards. I've been thinking about standards and how they're set and how we follow them. I remember my first job out of college. I was a member of the store leadership team for a big box retailer. And on one particular holiday weekend, I remember walking the store with the store manager and other members of the leadership team. We were looking at displays, verifying our pricing, talking about the weekend, anticipating the traffic, talking about specials, and what it would take to successfully run the store for that weekend. And I distinctly remember talking about the closing procedures for that Monday night after all the holiday to ensure that we would be ready for Tuesday morning. Okay, I've just shown my age because yes, there was a time that those stores were not open 24 hours a day. But that said, on that Monday evening, it was all I could do to get the doors closed, getting the people out, getting things secured, getting the registers counted down, the store cleaned up, and I did not get all of the displays set that were necessary for Tuesday morning's openings. And I remember coming in on Tuesday morning and the manager being upset with me that these things were not done, that the store was not at its standard for opening on Tuesday morning. And I talked with my mentor and I shared with her all of the things I had done and how hard I worked and everything that went on and all the challenges that I faced. And my question was, how in the world did he expect me to do all of this and still have the store in this particular condition? And she looked at me, as hard as it was for me to hear it, and she says, he was right and you were wrong because the standard had been set. And no matter what it took to do that, it was your responsibility as the closing manager to get it done. That made me think about this week's lesson as we look at what it means to honor God's standard. And in a time when God had already clearly laid out all that he wanted to be in place, everything that should have been, we saw last week that God's standard was violated by Adam and Eve in the garden. And we see that continuing in the story of this week. As a matter of fact, the punishment in last week's story was that there would always be this war now between the enemy, the serpent, and the woman's seed. And we see that pulling down into this week's story where the world we're going to see is now described as not just a little bad, but it is corrupt. We're talking about Noah, and we're familiar with the name of Noah. As a matter of fact, teachers this week, you're going to have to get through the lesson without saying Moses. It's Noah that we're talking about, and we're familiar with his story. Most of us picked it up in children's books in our first Bibles, but this is more than just a story about a man and an ark and his family and a boat. This is not a visit to the zoo. This is a real story of God's punishment on the earth. We see Noah first in Genesis chapter 5, and here in chapter 6, we get to know more about him, and his story carries all the way through chapter 9. Again, we see the story. In fact, when I Googled it, you see all these happy pictures of animals on the ark and people are smiling. But when Jesus and Peter talk about Noah in the New Testament, Noah is reflected as a sad story. And if you look at the condition of the earth and even what led to the flood, you realize that this indeed was a sad story. You should read from the top of chapter 6 for context, and you'll see just what we've mentioned, that God looks out on the wickedness of man, this wickedness that's continued since last week's lesson. And man hasn't just been evil once or twice, but verse 5 says that his heart was evil continually. And God looked at everything that he had created and he grieved over his own creation. And we've talked about this in recent weeks. If you missed them, go back and check out those videos. We've talked about the fact that God has been intimately involved with his creation. He even took pleasure in creation when he was making it. And now he gets to the point that the thing that he loves so much, he regrets even doing it. He's sorry that he even created man. He had a plan, he had a standard, but man has gone his own way. He has loved man, but man has not loved him back in that way. And we find man living not after God's heart, but after his own heart. The sin of man was great, and Genesis tells us that it was great in his heart. That means the things that came out of his heart, even in his mind, were evil, and it was greatly evil. But we'll learn in this week's lesson that Noah was very different. And Noah, according to verse 8, which is not our printed text, but verse 8, we learn that Noah was different. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 8 starts with the word but, meaning that there was something different about Noah from everything else that he lived inside of. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. That leads us to our printed text in verse 9. Here we start to receive the record of Noah, and we learn 4 things about him. First of all, we learn that he is righteous, that his conduct matched his standard for God. It matched what he knew that God required. He was a righteous man. He did all that he could to obey God. Now think about it. At this point, there is no law that's been given, but for everything that Noah knows about God and about the will of God, he does everything that he can to align to God's standard. And he doesn't just have a reputation, but his character matches. It's not just what people think about him in the public eye. That's your reputation. But character is who you are when no one is watching. So his reputation matches his character. He's blameless in his time is the second thing that we see. He's a moral man. He has no blemish on his record. When you call his name, there's nothing that anyone can say about him because he is a man of integrity. The third thing we see is that he walked with God. Now, this is not a common designation in the Bible. We see that Abraham, Enoch, and Moses walked with God, but this talks about his loyalty. It talks about his relationship with God and the authenticity of it. It was real. He walked with God, but the converse of that is that God was with him. And then we see that he was a father. There's some genealogy mentioned in here. And genealogy was significant to Hebrew people because in some way it talked about their relationship with God. So we learn that he's righteous, he's blameless, he walked with God, and that he is a father. And if you've downloaded your TSSG notes, you'll notice that I've given you some commonalities between Noah and Adam. There were lots of things that were similar about Noah and Adam. You should try to dig those out for your lesson if you have not already done so. The condition of the earth, we learn that in verse 11. The earth is a bad place. It is corrupt. There is nothing good in it. It is corrupt before God and in his sight. This tells me that God and man view the earth differently. If you go back again at the top of chapter 6 of Genesis, you'll see that man thinks he's in a beautiful place. Like man is enjoying life. Man's focus is very off. The things that were important to man were beautiful women, mighty warriors, having a great presence, having a great name, long life. But God sees something different. These are the things that man sees and enjoys, yet God sees only corruption. My aha here is that it really doesn't matter how man views the world and what man says is okay and the things that man celebrates, but we have to stay focused on the standard of God. So Noah was a man living in a corrupt environment, and yet we find out that in the midst of corruption, he was loyal, he was righteous, he was blameless, and in the midst of corruption, he walked with God. In other words, Noah was not living like the world around him. So we too can live victoriously even in a world around us that has sin inside of it. Noah was not overtaken by the influence of the world. My aha was that the world around us does not dictate our relationships with God. Romans 12:2 tells us to be not conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. But the world that Noah lived in was filled with violence. Now, the word filled, I circled that because that was pretty important. The last time we've seen the earth to be filled with anything, it was back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And Man was supposed to fill the world with things like him, to be fruitful and multiply and fill or replenish the earth after his own kind. And here instead, man has filled the earth with violence and filled the earth with sin. Instead of bringing life, now there's murder and sin in the world. So the earth has been filled with violence, and that was not God's intent. So in verse 12, God looks on the earth and sees that it's corrupt, and all of the flesh in the earth is corrupt. My ahas here were that God sees all, that he is looking. And I also noted that there are behaviors that break God's heart. In other words, we cannot live any kind of way without conscience of what it is that God wants. And here God looks at that thing that was formerly called very good when he created man. Remember, that was the first time that any of his creation was very good. And that thing that was once very good is now corrupt. It is spoiled. It is polluted. And it is all of it but this man Noah. In verse 13, God speaks and Noah listens. God announces his intentions. God is communicating with Noah. So I noted here that communication with God, being open, having an ear to him, having a connection to hear from him is important. Being in a place to hear from God is important. And because Noah has relationship with God, he is in a position to receive revelation from God, to know what's going on. He's been walking with God, and now God allows Noah to know his intent and his plan. God looks at what he sees and he makes a decision. Sin has already destroyed his plan, his intent for the world, and now God was going to destroy the thing that was already destroying itself. He was going to administer harsh judgment. Now look at this. God is making a decision. He doesn't consult with anyone. He doesn't consult with Noah. Notice that Noah is not even speaking back. God is delivering harsh judgment, and he does so from a sovereign place. He doesn't engage anyone else's opinion, and he makes a decision, and his judgment is final. I noted here that we have to watch statements of I feel, because it doesn't always matter how we feel. In this context, it didn't matter how Noah felt. It didn't matter how people felt. It only mattered how God felt about it. So we've got to be careful when we talk about how we feel, and we've got to think about how does God feel about it. In verses 14 through 16, God begins to speak to Noah, and he's giving him specific information for basically what is his plan of salvation. There is judgment coming, and there is a plan for salvation. And he gives Noah a very specific blueprint. He's going to give him something to do that has never been done before. And God makes it clear that it is a big assignment. It's a tough assignment. It wasn't even anything that Noah would necessarily understand, but God was faithful, and he gave him everything that he needed, every piece of direction, very specific instruction, size, material on how it was to be built to keep him safe. This was the plan of salvation, to keep Noah and his family safe. What I see in this is that we don't have to understand God's plans or his details to follow them. We just need to do what Noah did, and that is obey. And he was to obey and build this ark. Now notice the ark is not Noah's idea. This is God's idea. It's a big idea. That is a God idea. And this ark is not a boat like we think. There's no sail. There's no rudder. But this is like a massive water floating box. It's a massive box that is waterproof, made of gopher wood. It is huge. It is the length of a football field and a half. It's the width of a football field. It's the height of a football field. And it's got rooms inside of the ship, or the ark, that are safe havens. They're resting places. It's sealed so that it is waterproof. It's got a roof to keep the rain out, and it's got a door to go in and out. What I loved about the door was the fact that you can come in and out. It made it very clear that even though there were going to be some challenges that Noah would face, that he was going to come out. My personal reflection was that as massive and impressive as this ark was, I personally really focused not on the material, not on the construction, but again, this God idea that was so big, and Noah's response system was obedience. And for us, God sometimes will give us things that seem bigger than us, that seem bigger than anything that we can imagine, or maybe things that we just don't understand, knowing that things are going to come that we've never experienced before. But what God requires is obedience. This has all never been seen before. Not only does God give Noah an assignment bigger than anything ever seen, to build something bigger than anything ever seen, but in verse 17, he's going to allow a condition that has never been seen in the earth before. And that was enough water to come in and create a flood, to literally wipe out the existence of everything that had been created. Verse 18 starts with the word but, and we know that things change on the other side of the word but. Everything up to this point has been a salvation plan for a time of destruction, but something was going to be different for Noah and his family. This is the first time we see a covenant established in the Bible, and we talked about covenant last quarter being an agreement between two groups or two people. And God dictates the terms of the agreement. The terms of the agreement favor the people, but they also require compliance. And God binds himself to Noah by his word. God is faithful, and we can trust his word. And we see here a display of God's grace. And God has talked about this time of destruction. It's a time of judgment. It's judgment against sin, but things were going to be different for Noah. He makes a promise to Noah. He makes this covenant, and he remembers Noah. He makes this very personal. In verse 18, circle the word you. I'm establishing my covenant with you. It's not even with Noah's family. He's establishing the covenant with Noah. He separated Noah out because of the lifestyle that he lived. Before a time of judgment, the way Noah lived caused him to have favor in the sight of God. Noah is viewed differently in God's eyes. And look at this. Noah's family, we don't learn much about them and how they lived, but what we see is that they benefit because of the covenant that God makes with Noah. And there are people who are connected to us whose lives can be different because of the way that we live and the favor that we find with God. And also note this, that compliance was expected from Noah. Verse 19 says, and thou shalt come into the ark. So he was expected to comply with all of the information. In verses 19 through 21, we learn that two of each kind, male and female, were to be brought onto the ark. In a subsequent chapter, we actually learned that it's 7 pairs of each kind, but we know that that was to ensure reproduction after the flood. And I saw an interesting detail that I've never paid attention to before in verse 20. Sort of made me laugh a little bit thinking about a friend of ours who came over. She's actually our Sunday school superintendent, who came over a couple of weeks ago when we were traveling to let my sister's dog out and to walk her and feed her and all of that stuff that goes along with pet ownership. But she let her out with no leash, and the dog went running all over the neighborhood. And so she's chasing the dog. She's screaming for the dog to come back. And eventually, after several minutes, it sort of all comes together and she gets the dog back in the house. But I noted in verse 20 that that was not Noah's experience. He did not have to get a lasso out. He didn't have to run. He did not chase. He didn't have to round up. Everything came to him. The animals came. His family all came to Noah. My aha here was that when we are saved, they were going onto the ark to be saved. When we are saved, it's not because God chases us down. It's because we come to him. Again, there's 2 of every living kind of flesh. Notice that flesh is not fish. The fish were going to be in the water. So this is all kinds of flesh. And this does preserve the reproductive opportunity. Also, there is food for every type of creature on here, and that was wowing to me. Again, when you think about directionally, this is 7 pairs of animals. What is the variety of food that's required for the different types of animals, and what was the quantity of the food, and how did you keep it from spoiling, and how did you store it? All of these questions, we know the answer was this was a God thing. So this was even beyond anything that we could even conceive today on how he would have survived in this time. But again, he was obedient without worrying about these things. Verse 22 tells us just that. We see Noah's obedience. Thus Noah did. He did according to what God commanded. He just did it. He took God at his word, and our obedience to God is everything. And we see here that obedience to everything God told Noah was going to be critical for his salvation. I want you to note this as well. In this lesson text, there has been one speaker. And as children, even though we looked at this story and we see Noah and we learn about this man and all that he did with these animals, his family, and building the ark, if you look at this particular lesson, this really hasn't been about Noah at all. This has been all about God, a sovereign God who had a plan. Noah has not spoken. He has only obeyed. His opinion has not been engaged. At no point in this lesson has man spoken. He has only obeyed. And as we look at that, that should be our lives today, that we should obey what God tells us to do and to realize that God is the central character. God is the central plan maker, and he has the best plan for our lives. These are my key learnings from the week. The first is doing things your way, following your own passions versus God's way becomes destructive. And we know that looking at the condition of the earth. Again, the top of Genesis 6, 1 through 3, man seeing things his way, enjoying things his way, was not God's way. And it's not how we feel about the standard, but it's God's standard that we must strictly follow without respect of how we feel about it. His standard requires our obedience. We must align our behaviors and our actions, not to our feelings, not to what we want to justify, not to the things that we want to do, but to God's standard. Secondly, reputation and character matter. Reputation is what people see on the outside. It's what they know about you. But character is what's on the inside. And your reputation and your character should match each other. You shouldn't be one person on the outside and when you present in public and someone else on the other side. But they should match. The next thing is that when God asks you to do something bigger than you imagine, first of all, he's going to give you the plan. He's going to give you the provision. He's going to give you everything that you need to be successful. And you don't have to know all of the details to be obedient. You don't have to know everything that he wants every step of the way to simply give him your yes. The next is that we must keep our communication open, listen to the voice of God, and respond. But that requires stilling ourselves long enough to hear God. Even in our prayer times, it's not about throwing everything against the wall that we need, but in turn, taking that time to still ourselves, to listen and to hear the voice of God. It is important that we make time for God. Make time for your relationship with God. Next, there are people whose lives can and will be changed when we listen to and obey the voice of God. And we see that with Noah, again, being reminded that we don't learn anything about his family, how they lived. In this context, what we see is that they are saved as a result of who they're connected to. And there are some people that are going to be blessed because they are connected to you. Last is this: the way we live our lives determines how God sees us in the judgment. Looking at this corrupt world, a place that God regretted that he created. He was sorry that he did it. And yet he found one man who was different in the way that he lived. And it determined the covenant, his being willing to enter a promise with that man because he saw something different. A man who understood that the way that man viewed the world was not God's view of the world. And he worked not only to see God's way, but to align with God's standard. This is our lesson for this week. I can't wait to hear what you learned about it. Feel free to leave me comments below so that I can add your notes to my notes and study a little bit more. I'm excited to hear from you this week. Don't forget, if you like this video, to click the thumbs up so that we get to our 1,000. That's it. Thank you for being with me this week. I'll see you in Sunday school. Bye, everybody.